she woke up in a hospital bed, afraid to open her eyes, because she didn't know if James would still be there. Hello everyone, hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're going to explore a quiet but emotional turning point between James and Diep. Their first night in the hospital, where fear, love and unspoken promises come together. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The hospital at night had a sound of its own. Not silence, never silence, but a soft, steady rhythm. Machines breathed in measured tones. Footsteps echoed far down empty corridors. Somewhere, a door closed gently, as if even the building itself was trying not to disturb those inside. Diep woke slowly. At first, she didn't open her eyes. She only felt the weight in her body, heavy and unfamiliar, as though she had slept in the wrong place for too long. Her head throbbed faintly. Her throat was dry. The air around her felt colder than it should have been. When she finally opened her eyes, the ceiling above her was white. Too white. Bright in a way that made her blink. This wasn't where she had fallen asleep. Panic stirred quietly just beneath her ribs. She turned her head, careful, cautious. The room swayed for a moment, then settled. And then she saw him. James sat beside the bed, close enough that she could have reached him if she tried. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his elbows resting on his knees. He hadn't taken off his jacket, his hair was uneven, pushed back by tired hands. His face, usually calm, measured, looked worn, as if the night had carved lines into it. He was watching her, not casually, not distracted. He was watching her the way someone watches a fragile flame, afraid that even breathing too hard might make it disappear. "You're awake," he said quietly. His voice was low, careful, like he was afraid to startle her. Diep nodded. The small movement made her dizzy again, and she closed her eyes for a second until the feeling passed. "Where am I?" she asked. "The hospital," James said. "You fainted. They brought you in right away." The word settled slowly in her mind. Hospital. Her chest tightened. "How long?" she asked. "A few hours," he replied. "They wanted to keep you overnight, just to be safe." Overnight. She exhaled, shallow and controlled. Staying meant waiting. Waiting meant uncertainty. And uncertainty was something Diep had never learned to sit with comfortably. She glanced around the room. The pale walls, the narrow bed, the machine beside her, its screen glowing softly, lines rising and falling in calm repetition. James followed her gaze. "It's just monitoring," he said gently. "Your heart rate, oxygen, everything's stable." She nodded, but her eyes lingered on the screen longer than necessary. The steady beeping reminded her that her body had failed her, even if only briefly. James noticed the tension in her shoulders. Without saying anything, he stood and pulled the blanket up a little higher, tucking it carefully around her arms. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if every action mattered. "Try to rest," he said. "You're okay." She wanted to believe him. Truly she did. But the quiet here felt different. It wasn't the comforting silence of early mornings or quiet roads. It was a hollow quiet, filled with reminders that she wasn't in control. Outside the window, darkness pressed against the glass. Somewhere far away, rain began to fall. Soft at first, then steady. The sound barely reached the room, but Diep noticed it anyway. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly. James looked up. "Sorry for what?" "For this," she said. "For stopping everything." He frowned slightly. "You didn't stop anything." "We were supposed to keep going," she replied. "We had plans." He moved closer, pulling the chair nearer to her bed. "Plans change." She turned her head away, staring at the window. "Not like this." James studied her profile, the tension in her jaw, the way her fingers curled into the sheets. "This isn't a delay," he said softly. "It's a choice." She didn't answer. "You don't have to stay," she said after a moment. "Once they finish checking me, I'll be fine." He didn't hesitate. "I'm not leaving." She looked at him then, really looked at him. His eyes were tired but steady. certain in a way that made her chest ache. "You should sleep," she said. "You look worse than I feel." He almost smiled. "I'll sleep later." "James, I mean it," he said, gently but firmly. "Later." A nurse entered quietly, adjusting the IV, checking the monitor. James stepped aside immediately, watching every movement, his attention sharp. "She's stable," the nurse said, as if even the smallest movement might break the fragile calm they had found. Minutes passed, maybe more. Diep's eyes finally closed, not in exhaustion, but in surrender. A light sleep, fragile and shallow, but sleep nonetheless. James watched her chest rise and fall. Only then did he let himself breathe fully. He thought about the road they had been on, the plans they had made, the places they hadn't reached yet. None of it mattered. Not tonight. His thumb brushed gently over the back of her hand, barely a movement. "I'm here," he whispered, even though she was already asleep. The machine beside her flickered, just slightly. The rhythm shifted. James's eyes snapped to the screen. His body tensed instantly. The quiet night seemed to pause, holding its breath. The rhythm settled back into its steady pattern. He exhaled, carefully, as if afraid that relief itself might disturb something fragile. The night continued. Outside, the rain grew heavier, tapping against the window in uneven patterns. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rolled past, wheels squeaking softly before fading into distance. The hospital carried on with its quiet, unseen work. James stayed still. His body ached from the chair, from the hours of sitting without rest, but he didn't move. He didn't want to risk waking her. He didn't want to leave the space between them, however small it was. Time stretched in strange ways. Minutes felt long. Hours blurred together. At some point, Diep stirred. Not awake, just a shift. A small frown formed between her brows. Her fingers twitched in his hand. James leaned in immediately. "I'm here," he whispered, barely louder than the rain. Her breathing quickened for a moment, uneven, as if she were caught in a dream she didn't like. Her grip tightened. "James," she murmured, her voice thin. "I'm here," he repeated. "You're okay." She turned her head slightly toward him, eyes still closed. Her expression softened when she felt his hand, solid and warm. "I thought you left," she said quietly. His chest tightened. "I wouldn't." Even in sleep, the words seemed to reach her. Her breathing slowed again. The tension in her hand eased, though she didn't let go. James stayed, leaned in, his free hand resting on the edge of the bed. He watched her face closely, the faint shadows under her eyes, the way her lashes rested against her cheeks. She looked smaller here, not weak, but unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. He realized then how little she'd ever let him see of this side of her. The side that was tired, the side that was afraid, the side that needed someone else to stay. The nurse returned quietly around midnight. She checked the IV, glanced at the monitor, and gave James a small, reassuring nod. "She's doing fine," she said softly. "It's normal for the readings to fluctuate a bit while she sleeps." James nodded, relief settling more deeply this time. "Thank you." When the nurse left, the room felt warmer somehow, less clinical, less threatening. James finally allowed himself to lean back slightly, though he kept hold of Diep's hand. His eyelids felt heavy, but he resisted sleep. He didn't trust it yet. His thoughts drifted instead. He thought about the moment earlier that day, how quickly everything had changed. One moment they had been walking, talking about nothing important. The next she had stumbled, her face pale, her body giving in without warning. He had never felt fear like that before. Not sharp panic, not loud terror. Something quieter, deeper, the kind that sits in your chest and refuses to move. He looked at her again. "I should have noticed sooner," he murmured to himself. She'd been tired, quieter than usual, slower. He had seen it. He just hadn't wanted to stop. For what? For staying. He didn't answer right away. Then quietly, "There was nowhere else I needed to be." Her eyes softened. She seemed to want to say something more, but fatigue pulled her back before the words could come. "Can you stay close?" she asked, almost shyly. He stood and adjusted the chair, pulling it even nearer to the bed. "Like this?" She nodded. Her eyes closed again, this time without fear, without tension. Sleep took her gently, as if she had finally allowed herself to rest. James watched the monitor, steady, calm. He watched her, breathing even, face peaceful. For the first time that night, he let his eyes close, just for a moment. Not sleep, just rest. The hospital continued its quiet rhythm around them, and in that small room between soft rain and steady machines, the world slowed enough for both of them to breathe again.
Trong tập này, Linda và Linda theo bà và cậu cháu ra nương mía. Dưới nắng sớm, bà vừa chặt mía vừa kể chuyện ngày xưa. Dạy chặt 3 hoặc 4 khúc cho đẹp để bán được giá. Đồng mía cao dần, 45 đồng trở thành hy vọng cho nhân thực. Một cây mía đổ bất ngờ khiến cả nhóm kêu, rồi cười xòa vì kịp đỡ nhau. Chiều xuống, Linda buồn bã vì con rúi của mình đã biến mất. Nghi có kẻ trộm rình quanh nhà. CEO quang ghế đến lắng nghe và trấn an và tự sửa chiếc camera cũ trong kho, kéo dây lắp trước sân nhà để bảo vệ cô. Đêm đến, Linda nấu cơm nếp cẩm mời anh ở lại ăn. Hai người trò chuyện lòng ấm lại. Quang kể áp lực công ty, camera nháy sáng, bóng lạ thoáng qua, và không biết Linda có sống sót qua được đêm nay không. Mọi người nếu thấy video hay, hãy cho mình một like, một subscribe. Cảm ơn mọi người nhé.